Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Ian Scott. I'm an attorney. I have an M.B.A. I have a C.P.A. But kind of probably most important to this group is that I am also an entrepreneur. I used to work in an investment bank for many years. I used to work at Credit Suisse. I used to write accounting opinions for business transactions, so very familiar with the business side. Then I had the long-burning desire to go to law school. And so I left my investment banking job, went to Harvard Law School, graduated, and the plan when I started law school was really to go back to investment banking. But when I started law school, I realized that there was it was just my passion and that I was put on this planet to be a lawyer. So left after law school, went and worked in a large law firm for a short period of time, about a year, and then started my own practice. So now we have a few employees and a few lawyers, a few paralegals, and so everything's going really well. Just as an aside before we start the presentation, one thing about being an entrepreneur, I think that, there are entrepreneurs like, Facebook entrepreneur, there's just, Gates, there are lots of entrepreneurs, but, an entrepreneur can really be anybody who's really starting their business. And what I, encourage you to do is if you do want to be an entrepreneur, that you do it and pick a passion of yours and actually explore that passion. Because as I work, I feel like I actually don't work, that, I'm actually doing something that I really, really love. So in terms of the presentation, what we're going to do is we're going to explore the life of Donald and Ivana. And Donald and Ivana are two people that they want to start a business together, and they have kind of, similar goals. They are a little different, and we'll go through some facts, because I think that the way that we're going to do this is we're going to do it more like a case study. We're going to give you some facts, and then we're going to go through the application of some legal factors. So the presentation is really going to focus on taking a look at two people who want to start a business and going through the legal implications and some of the legal issues associated with them starting a business. Now, the one thing that is unusual, or the kind of addition to this presentation, is that Ivana is not a U.S. citizen, and Ivana is a Swiss national. So we're also going to spend the first part of the presentation talking about immigration and kind of her ability to work in this country, and then move on to the legal aspects. So some facts. So as I said, Donald, he's a U.S. citizen. Ivana is a Swiss citizen. They both go to Pace University. Ivana is a computer science major. That's going to be important because when we talk about some of the options, the immigration options for Ivana, computer science is one option that gives her more options. And Donald is in the entrepreneurship program. Ivana is on an F1 visa, so that's the student visa for people who are not from this country. And another thing that's going to be important when we talk about the immigration consequences is Ivana, she's quite accomplished. She's won a number of national and international competitions related to coding, and she's published in a few academic journals. Donald and Ivana are dating, and so there's no relationship to Donald and Ivana Trump. So that might actually be before some of your time, like Donald Trump used to be married to Ivana Trump, but it's just that they have the same first names. And they have a great business idea. They've developed a mobile application that is going to change the world. So a couple of things. Donald, he's registered a business, but he's done it as a sole proprietorship. So we're going to talk through whether that's a good idea and maybe some other options. Ivana, she's also registered a business, and her friend mentioned something to her about an S selection, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail, what exactly that means. They've decided to work together, and then, like most partners that start a business together, Donald and Ivana really get along well. And Ivana was just commenting to a friend, saying that her and Donald are always on the same page, and in fact, especially when it comes to business, that they are, really on the same page. Now, Ivana, while she's in school, she actually volunteers a couple days a week at a tech startup, and we're going to talk about that and kind of, from an immigration perspective, whether or not she is able to do that. Now, Donald has a little bit of money in the bank. Ivana has a lot more money in the bank, and again, we're going to use that to kind of go through some of the immigration issues. So the first kind of question, the rhetorical question, if not a question, can Ivana work in the United States? And the clear answer is no, she can't. She can't work in the United States unless she has a visa. And in fact, what may come as a surprise to people is you can't even volunteer in the United States if you don't have a visa. You're not allowed to. You could be barred for 10 years for for what Ivana is currently doing. So what are some of Ivana's visa options? So the first visa option for Ivana is that she could get married to Donald. And Donald is a US citizen, and it's a visa option that is a great one because she will not only have a green card in a year, she would get work authorization within 90 days. And all of her issues would be solved. And in fact, marriage kind of in the United States is one of the few immigration categories that really forgives everything. If you're in the United States undocumented for 20 years and working and you marry somebody, the government says we're going to forgive everything, and you kind of move forward. And that's it's the only category that actually permits that. So. It is one. Now, in terms of marriage, the other kind of interesting thing about marriage is that the definition of marriage in the United States is not that two people love each other, and there's a really interesting case that dealt with it, and it was about a caregiver that was married to someone and they were not in love, they were just living together, and the judge said that that's as good a reason as any to be married, and the definition is that you plan on spending a long-term life together. So. Now, this next option is B1 and F1. Now, so Ivana is on an F1 visa, and we'll cover this fairly quickly, but after she graduates, she's already granted kind of 12 months that she's able to to live and work in the United States, and she can work really anywhere. She can start her own business, she can work for anybody else, but it is only 12 months. But because Ivana is a science major, and you may have heard of this in terms of the push in the technology industry to allow more talent to come to the United States, there's something called STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And because she's a computer science major, she can actually apply for another almost 18 months. So in total, she can actually work after she graduates for about 30 months without problem. And again, she can do anything and work for anyone during that time, including starting her own business. A B visa, that's really just a tourist visa, but that's also an option for students when they leave. They can either transfer from an F status to a B status, or they can leave the country and re-enter on a B status. But the problem with the B visa is that it doesn't permit you to work. You can be here, you can go to tourist attractions, you can do all of that, but you can't work in the United States. So the next visa, and this is a really popular visa, and I happen just to be talking about this visa to somebody, just before I came into this class, and it's called an E2 visa. And what this visa is, it's an investment visa. Now, Ivana has $100,000 in the bank. Now, what Ivana can do is she can invest in the United States. So she would have to get office space. She might have to, buy some equipment. But Ivana could spend around $20,000 in the United States and then put $80,000 in a business bank account, and that would be sufficient for her to get an E2 visa. A couple things with the E2 visa, though, is that you have to be a national of a treaty country. So Switzerland happens to be a treaty country, and there are many other countries that are treaty countries. Two countries that are the most populous countries, unfortunately, are not. India and China are not. So if you're from India or you're from China, you have to explore other visa options. But there are many, many countries on the list. The other thing with this visa is that you have to, the business can't be a business that is just set up to support you and your family. So you have to put together a comprehensive business plan. Normally the business plans that we put together for our clients, they're in excess of 40 pages. It has to be a credible business plan. And you have to show the government that you plan on creating US jobs. The next visa, you probably heard about this visa. It's a lot of controversy associated with this visa because it's a visa where many complain that someone can buy citizenship or buy a green card, and I guess it's correct, but because of the way that the visa is structured, it is beneficial for the U.S. economy. So what this visa is if you invest $500,000 or $1 million, and the determination of how much you invest depends on where you are in the country. So if you're in what's called a troubled economic area, and that's defined by unemployment rate of 1.5 times the national average, then you only have to invest $500,000. If you're in any other area, then you're required to invest $1 million. So you have to invest that in the business, but then the business actually has to, in a 2-year period, create 10 full-time jobs. And so that's full-time is full-time. It's not a combination of part-time jobs. It's not, you can pay them anything you want. You can pay them minimum wage, but you have to create at least 10 full-time jobs. So what the government does is they give you a green card, but it's a conditional green card. And then after 2 years, you have to file another immigration petition and show the government that you actually have created those 10 jobs. And if you haven't created the 10 jobs, they would just take the visa away from you. But it's it's a popular visa with a lot of foreign national students. They have, again, India and China are two countries that can't get an E2 visa. A lot of parents will, gift the money to their children. It doesn't have to be money that you earned. It can be a gift from a parent. Will gift the money to their children, and those applications are very, very popular. The O1 visa, it's another visa that's available to, in particular, someone like Ivana. So we saw in the fact pattern in this case that Ivana was quite accomplished. She had published things in publications. She had won a number of competitions. And what this visa is, it's a visa that really says that the individual has risen to the top of their profession, and the government is taking a look at this person and really wants them to stay in the country. So as long as the person is actually going to do what it is that they are good at, or they've demonstrated that they're good at, then they can get this visa, or this visa may be available to them. It can be renewed indefinitely, but the one problem with this visa, it's a very, very, very difficult visa to get. It's a very subjective visa as well, because what is good, what is exceptional. But it is a very, very difficult visa to get, but one that that is available for students, and in this case, perhaps Ivana. The last visa that we're going to talk about is the H1B visa, and this is probably the most popular visa for students. And the reason it's the most popular visa for students is because it has a relatively low bar. So the bar for this visa, all of the other visas, I'm going through them very quickly in terms of what the requirements are. However, I could spend an hour talking about each of them. With the H1B visa, though, the requirement is just that you have to have a bachelor's degree. Or the job rather has to have a bachelor's degree. So that sometimes can be quite easily demonstrated. If the job is for a C.P.A. or an accountant, it can be really easily demonstrated, because if the job is one that needs a bachelor's degree, then it's easy to demonstrate that. Sometimes for some professions, like if you have a bachelor's degree, but then we had one person that came to us and wanted to get an H1B visa, and he was a chef, and he had a bachelor's degree from a good school. He was a good chef. But the government wasn't satisfied that the job that he was doing actually required a bachelor's degree. The one thing to keep in mind with this visa, though, is that way more people want this visa than there are visas available. So it's the only visa, it's one of for the purpose of this discussion, it's the only visa in this on this board where there's a quota, where the quota is actually used. So last year there were 85,000 spots available, and within the first 5 days, and they don't, if you file on day 5, it's as if you filed on day 1. So within the first 5 days, they received 125,000 applications. So they just returned, they just returned the application. They did a lottery, said, okay, your petition gets adjudicated, and the remainder they just returned to the applicants. And that happened last year as well. And we expect the H1B season's coming up again in April, and we expect it to happen again. And it's really unfortunate because my firm had a number of H1B petitions that we filed last year, and some were for students, and that was their only ability to work in the United States. So when they didn't even get selected, they didn't really have, some of them actually went back to school, but they didn't really have any other option. So those are really the visa options. There are other visa options, but those are really the visa options that are available to Ivana. So now we're going to move to legal considerations. Now, as I said in the facts, that Ivana and Donald want to start a business together. And so the first legal consideration that we're going to talk about is, should Ivana and Donald draft a partnership agreement? Now, the first bullet point, friends today, enemies tomorrow. I cannot tell you how many situations that my firm runs into where, after the fact, we represent one side of a failed business, failed business arrangement. So the business hasn't even failed yet, but just a failed business arrangement. So, when you start a business, everyone's happy. No one's making money yet. Usually, everyone's happy. Everyone kind of has assigned tasks, etc. But then, as time moves on, you quickly realize that it becomes very difficult. Lots of things are difficult to do with other people. Like traveling is very difficult to do with other people. Living with someone else is very difficult to do as a roommate or in a relationship. Those are difficult things to do. Well, this is added to that list of starting a business with a partner is a very, very difficult thing to do. And so the question of whether you should draft a partnership agreement, the answer, it's just absolutely yes, because despite the fact that, Ivana thinks that Donald is the one, and in this particular story, they go on to get married and make lots of money, and then Ivana takes him for a lot of money in this particular story. But, that's just the fact is what happens is that people have disagreements. So, a partnership agreement, it's just a contract. It's a contract between it's a contract between your partner, and it's a contract between the legal entity that you actually set up. Now, in terms of the types of agreements, we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of business entities, but if you set up a limited liability company, the agreement that we're talking about here in terms of a partnership agreement is called an operating agreement, and that's the agreement that's going to outline exactly how the two partners or more partners operate together and how the partners operate with the actual firm. And in an LLC, the limited liability company, the partners are called members. The other type of agreement, if it's a corporation, it's a shareholder agreement. They have just have different names, but they have really the same standard clauses in them. But really the purpose of them is as I described. So in terms of what goes into these agreements, like the standard clauses, and the standard clauses are really kind of what people would fight about. Like what do we see that people fight about? And one of the things that people fight about is how profits are distributed. At the beginning, when there's no money, everyone kind of generally thinks, well, or you don't talk about it, or no one says anything, and you kind of say, well, there are two of us, so it's going to be 50-50, right? But then someone always has in their mind that they're doing more, right? Whether they are or not, it's irrelevant, but they have it in their mind that they're doing more, or they've contributed more. But that's one of the things that you would want to put in the agreement. Another important thing that you want in the agreement is how decisions are handled. The benefit of sitting back and kind of contemplating or thinking about everything that could go wrong is that you actually try to address how you're going to handle those things that could go wrong before they actually do go wrong. So very common provisions in these agreements are how do you handle deadlock. If there are two partners that each own 50% of the shares and you don't agree, kind of what happens? Like, does it go to arbitration? Does one person get, get to decide? And even what types of things are going to be kind of subject to this deadlock provision? Is one person going to manage the day-to-day operations? Those types of things. So all of those things, and really as much as you can think of, should go into these agreements. Who contributed what, and how much it's worth, because we talked in the facts that Donald and Ivana had both developed code that they both now hold in two separate entities. And now they want to start a new business entity, and they're going to move that intellectual property, because it value, right? They're developing a mobile application. The thing could be ready to launch or almost ready to launch, and that has value. And when you say who contributed what, Ivana has $100,000 in cash, Donald has $1,000 in cash. Maybe that all goes into the business, and that's one thing that's easy to kind of say, well, someone just contributed 1,000, someone contributed 100,000. But then, intellectual property or other equipment, all of those types of things you want to be able to kind of memorialize so that if there is a liquidation or if the company doesn't work out, that you're not kind of debating who gets what. I'm doing a settlement agreement for these two, for this one company right now, and they were two partners, and everything was fine at the beginning, but they didn't write down anything, not anything at all. And even as I represented one side, I actually had to take the argument that they hadn't formed anything, because it was really a situation where my client contributed 95% of the assets, the other client contributed 5% of the assets, but then when they filed their tax form, the tax form said it was 50-50. So the other side was making the argument that I own 50% of the company, but that was the only legal or other document that existed. But I kind of had to go back and make the argument that no, because they didn't do anything. They didn't. Not only did they not do a shareholder agreement, they didn't have a shareholder meeting. They didn't, kind of issue stock. So I kind of had to make the argument that this company hadn't even been formed yet. So so we're dealing with this division of property for a legal entity that has not even been formed yet. But to the extent that they had all those things written down, it would have been very easy. Like, my client has all the power in this case, but the other person would have had a lot more power if he was able to kind of define in an agreement what he contributed. So another legal consideration, what type of legal entity should Donald and Ivana set up? So we know that Donald set up a sole proprietorship, and we're going to talk about two other types of legal entities, corporations and LLCs. The only legal entity that we should just completely cross off the list is a sole proprietorship. So we should, if you're setting up a business, if you're an entrepreneur, there's really no reason to set up a sole proprietorship. It could be that you feel the benefit of the sole proprietorship is it's the simplest to set up. But I think that you'll see as we talk about limited liability that the risk associated with that far outweighs the ease of setup. So the other two types of entities, legal entities to set up, are corporations or limited liability companies. And really the key aspect of both of these types of entities is that your liability is limited. So some say, well, no one's going to sue me for anything, and what do I have? Or I run a pretty streamlined operation here, but you can be sued for anything. Someone can come into your premises, they can slip and fall, and they sue you. If you don't have a limited liability entity, then they sue you, like you personally they sue, and they can get a judgment against you, and the judgment doesn't go away, right? So even when you are making money down the road, you would have to pay them. Then other things that you may not think of, even something like copyright infringement, like something like taking, you develop a website and you use pictures and you think photos and you think, oh wow, that's fine, but then all of a sudden someone is very angry and they're sending you not only cease and desist letters, but they're sending you into the copyright law sometimes allows for just statutory damages, like you infringe and you just get, even though the other party hasn't actually suffered damages, then you could be subject to actual damages. So there are lots of reasons that you can get sued, and the biggest reason you set up a limited liability entity is so that it's only the entity that can be sued and you are not subject to any personal liability. So now kind of the decision of which one of those two to select, a corporation or a limited liability company. Now, one of the, when clients come to us and they say, which one should I do, and we say, well, here's a questionnaire, but really, the key aspects of what dictates which entity you're going to set up are some of the things that we're going to talk about. So, do you plan on raising capital? So do you plan on, is your business one that you plan on going out and seeking and attracting capital from investors? And if the answer to that is yes, then there's a very good chance that you're going to set up a corporation. And the reason for that is that you are going to, when you are seeking capital from investors, you are issuing a product, and everyone knows what a common stock is, everyone knows what a preferred stock is, but many people, if I say, well, what's a membership unit, and they say, I have no idea, because in an LLC that's what the product is. It's a membership unit. That's what you have to call it. It's called a membership unit. And then you have to develop, so while most people kind of know what a preferred share is, when you start to say preferred membership unit and you start to develop these things that people really aren't familiar with the concepts, I think it just becomes a lot more difficult. So really, with raising capital, the corporation gives you a lot more flexibility. Similarly, if your business gets large enough and your raising capital moves from just raising capital from friends and family and other investors to venture capital funds, a venture capital fund would never deal with an LLC. They would immediately get you to switch the LLC over to a corporation, which isn't the end of the world, but it's just more legal work and more headache. But they would get you to switch the LLC over to a corporation, because that's what they're used to dealing with, and that's what, when they are trying to raise capital, or when they're defining the terms of the product that they're buying from you when they give you money, they're not interested in dealing with membership units or any other terminology other than that. Now, the other consideration when you look at which type of entity to set up has to do with how sophisticated you are. So the whole reason that LLCs were created was because people thought corporations were too complex. So LLC is a relatively new invention. Now the reason people thought corporations are too complex goes back to, similar to the argument that I was making with that case that I'm dealing with. When you have a corporation, what you're required to do is file documents with the State Department, so the State Department sets up your corporation, so you have a name of a corporation. But then what you're required to do is you're required to, even if it's just a corporation that you formed yourself, you're required to sit down, have a meeting with yourself. You have to take minutes of that meeting. You have to, memorialize everything, and you have to issue stock from the company to yourself or to the other investors. And all of that has to be memorialized in minutes. And what we call corporate formalities have to be adhered to. And if they're not adhered to, you can subject, it's almost as if the conclusion can be that it's almost as if you didn't have a corporation, that you really are just, could be personally liable. It's called piercing the corporate veil, but but that's in essence. So people found that confusing. I personally don't find it that difficult, but people did find it confusing. So they created an LLC, and all of those corporate formalities are eliminated with an LLC. So with an LLC, all you have to do is prepare an operating agreement, generally speaking. And the operating agreement, if it's a single member LLC, you could probably download something from the internet that would be sufficient. If you had two people, then you might want to hire someone to draft a proper partnership agreement. But in essence, the LLC is just a lot simpler. You don't have to adhere to those same corporate formalities that are associated with the corporation. So some people opt for an LLC because they just find it a little easier. So some people, for example, they don't plan on raising capital. They're starting their own business. They want to kind of have the least amount of complexity, and they opt for an LLC. The other reason that that people pick one or two, either a corporation or an LLC, has to do with tax returns, and this is kind of a more practical implication. And really, with a corporation, you have to file it's a separate legal entity, and you have to file a separate tax return. So you have to, most people can't file a corporate tax return. You have to hire an accountant, and you have to pay the accountant, and it's not cheap, and you have to do that in perpetuity, every year, and sometimes there are going to be quarterly filings. So with the LLC, it's a little different, because an LLC is, and we're going to talk about S-election, but an LLC is what's known as a pass-through entity, and you don't have to prepare a separate tax return for an LLC, and instead you just get to add one schedule to your personal return. Because the way that an LLC works, you're electing this, but the default election is just that the LLC is set up, and it's as if, really for tax purposes, that you are the LLC. So if an LLC makes $100,000 in profit, that $100,000 gets put on your personal tax return, and it's one schedule that is on your personal tax return, rather than actually having to prepare a completely separate return. So it's something that when you start to add up the cost, you'll find that a corporation is probably more expensive, because the paying for the tax preparation services of a corporation can be quite costly. Now, Ivana had asked, she set up a corporation, someone mentioned to her something about an S-election. And what an S-election is that one of the reasons that sometimes people opt for an LLC as well is that, as I said, it's a pass-through entity. Now, what a pass-through entity does is it avoids double taxation. So the way that entities are taxed in the United States, if you set up a corporation, then you're going to, let's say you make $100,000, a corporation makes $100,000, then there's a corporate tax that's applied to that, right? So it's a percentage of the profits that's applied. So now what is left, you can distribute to shareholders, and then shareholders pay another tax. So that's called double taxation. So what S-election allows you to do, as long as everybody in the corporation, like let's say there are two of you, as long as everyone decides that they want to elect for S status, as long as everyone decides it, because S-election is a IRS designation, then the corporation is treated as a pass-through entity. So still a separate tax return is prepared, but the you avoid double taxation. So that's but S-election can get fairly complicated, but just something to maybe keep in mind. 83B election. So to the extent that you are receiving shares, like, so if you're a founder or you're kind of investing in another company and you're a founder and someone's drafting an agreement for you and you're getting shares of a company, speak to your tax accountant, because the 83B election is a very important election that you have to make. And I'm just going to touch, it is a somewhat complicated election, but in essence what happens is that if you have certain types of shares, then you could end up paying taxes on those shares even though you haven't received a penny, right? So the 83B election kind of avoids that taxation occurring, on an individual level. So just something to keep in mind whenever you get shares, whenever you start a company, whenever you get shares, speak to your accountant and say, what is an 83B election? And they can go into it in more detail. One question that we always get from clients when they come in and they're setting up a business entity is whether, we're in New York, and should we set up the corporation in New York or should we set it up in Delaware? Now, there's no kind of clear-cut answer. The reason that Delaware, and there are also some other states that are very friendly. New York, I'd say, is not that friendly to corporations. But they're friendly in terms of are there filing requirements? Do they just kind of leave people that set up corporations alone? Do they have a lot of regulation? So if they have a lot of that, they're unfriendly. Delaware doesn't have much of that at all. And then there's some other states that are very friendly as well. So sometimes people kind of ask, well, should I set up my corporation or my limited liability company in another state? Generally speaking, the answer is that you should set up a business entity in the state that you're doing business in, right? That's kind of generally speaking. Because the fact is, you're going to have to do that anyway. So if you set up a corporation in Delaware, for example, and you were doing business in New York, and doing business is a legal term, so it's a defined term. So if you'd have to look at a number of things, like do you have an office here, et cetera. But let's say that the government defined, said that you are doing business in New York, then you would have to adhere to New York filings anyway. So you would actually impose two sets of filing requirements on yourself, and the benefits associated with Delaware probably aren't, especially at a small company level, are probably not that significant. And so generally we advise people to kind of set up in where they actually plan on doing business. But that's a very, very common question that we get. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is intellectual property. So we know that Ivana and Donald have both spent a lot of time coding and doing different things like that. And we talked a little bit about this already, but kind of who owns what and kind of tracking who actually owns that. We represent a company right now where there's a Polish company and an American company, and both kind of founders, or two founders in Poland and one founder in the American company. They each individually have intellectual property. We set up a new company for them, and we're transferring the intellectual property into that new company, and they have a significant business venture that that's going to be associated with that. And they've already attracted venture capital funding. But but one of the things we had to do from the beginning was kind of go through and make sure it was crystal clear what was being transferred into the company, what it was valued at, et cetera, so that there were no issues with that later. Another thing with independent contracts, especially if your startup is a tech startup, is that if you hire independent contractors to develop code for you, you want to make sure that you have a good independent contractor agreement, because one of the things that are in that particular agreement is that you own the code, right? Because you don't want to be in this situation where whenever no one cares about what you've done if it's not successful, but the second it becomes successful, then everybody wants a piece and says that they did it, they made it, it was their idea, it was all of these different things. But so you want that agreement to be crystal clear that they're doing work for you. They're doing it on a contract for hire basis, and that they are, the code immediately, all intellectual property rights actually immediately vest with you. So it's definitely a very important contract that you definitely want to get them to sign. We talked about IP being transferred. And just, another thing just to consider, in this situation, especially when you have Donald and Ivana who had separate entities before they, started working together. We have another client, it was a very similar idea, and we had to bring in tax counsel before to kind of advise on exactly how the IP should be transferred, because there, with everything that you do with setting up a company and, running a business, kind of getting investors, always in the back of your mind you should have tax tax consequences, because even more so, if I had to decide between hiring me and hiring a tax attorney, I'd hire a tax attorney, because the tax attorney is going to save you money, right? Like I'm going to you comply with regulation or whatever, but the tax attorney is actually going to structure things so that a year or 2 years down the road you're not paying way more taxes than you had to pay if you just did some basic tax planning. So it's just something to consider. Tax counsel, very important, and we regularly, whenever we enter into a transaction or kind of work on deals, we always work on them in conjunction with tax counsel. And then just some of the things that you consider in terms of intellectual property, trademark, patents, copyrights. And when you start up a company, a lot of the time you don't have a lot of money, right? So one of the things to always consider, if you have a good idea, there are a lot of resources out there, right? So, there are incubators that, if they like your idea, they'll take you on and they'll offer kind of free legal advice to you. There are firms, there are big reputable firms out there that they'll do what's called a provisional patent for you and not charge you anything until your thing starts making money. So they kind of do it as a loss leader type thing, because they are. So, never be afraid to kind of seek out legal counsel, because it is, everyone recognizes you're on a budget, so it may not be that you can do, you may not be able to come to my firm, for example, but everyone realizes, or there are lots of opportunities for people to assist entrepreneurs and startups, and so you just have to kind of seek out those opportunities. We actually, in some cases, we had one client who came to us. They did their investor visas. They, raised capital. I think they raised around $800,000, and then they were accepted into an incubator in New York. So, they utilized that incubator after that to get some kind of legal services and things like that. So. Okay, so now we're going to spend this is really the last topic, but it is. We're going to talk about raising capital in the United States. So just some basic concepts, right? So when you sell securities, right? So when you start a company, if you start a company with a founder, and you both, let's say it's a corporation, and you say you issue 1 million shares, and one has 500,000, the other has 500,000. You don't have to do anything in terms of the SEC at that point, right? If you're both actively involved in the company. But let's say you want to raise money, like that example that I just gave you, where the people raised around $800,000 from friends and family, and they issued preferred stock. Now, you can't give away, you can't sell, you can't issue securities. It's all the same, whether it's a gift, selling. You can't issue securities in the United States unless the securities are registered. Registered means when you see these large companies and they have financial statements and they're audited and they have private placement memos, et cetera. So you can't do that in the United States unless they're registered, with the exception of if you can find an exemption, right? So one of the things that we help clients do is that when they're ready to kind of raise capital, we kind of explain the law in the area to them, and then we kind of tell them, okay, that if you're going to attract investors, here are the exemptions that are available to you. And because no one wants to, a small company doesn't want to register securities, right? You might spend $100,000 in legal fees kind of registering securities, because it's quite a process, right? But so you want to find an exemption. Spend time going through, these are the exemptions, and that means that you may only be able to sell to these types of investors. The example that I just gave you, where the company raised $800,000, they had another $50,000 of investors in 4 states within the United States But those investors weren't what are called accredited investors, so they weren't sophisticated investors. And so we actually advised them not to take the money from them, because if they took the money from them, they wouldn't be able to utilize the exemption that they actually utilized. So they ended up foregoing that $40,000, $50,000 because the rules are very, 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 very strict. Now, a lot of the time when people, do a startup and they, kind of do whatever they want, right? We have the company that we're representing right now that very, great startup, and they have a, kind of sales and a very, very large, kind of a household name institution for their product. And but they did 2 offerings where they didn't use counsel and didn't follow any of the rules. So now what's happening is we're trying to fix some of that, but also what I advise them is what you're going to have trouble with now is when a venture capital fund comes along, because the way that it works is you do, a lot of the time people do friends and family round financing. They get some money so they can further develop their product and their business idea, and once that's done, then big companies, these venture capital funds, see the potential in these companies, and they say, we're going to give you 5 or 10 million, or how much, give you money, and we're going to take back a portion of the company. So, but the venture capital funds often, if you have, if your company is too much trouble to deal with because you have, either flagrantly ignored SEC law or have a lot of issues with that, then, it could be that the venture capital fund decides that they, don't want to invest in your company because they have lots of options, right? They have lots of options. Great. Okay. Well, there's a little bit about myself there, and I think we talked about most of the things at the beginning of the presentation, and then we will move to questions and answers.
Okay. Thank you.